Imagine, you're in ancient Rome, you're sitting in a public toilet, shoulder to shoulder with a dozen strangers. There's no paper. Instead, there's a single sea sponge on a stick, and when the person to your right finishes, they rinse it in the trough and hand it to you. And now think, this was considered civilized, the height of convenience. Ah, there you are. I'm sorry for such an invigorating start, but you wouldn't believe me otherwise. My name is Jasper Diggs, and today we're going to explore the most inappropriate and, frankly, the most fascinating topic in human history. Today we're going to talk about the history of hygiene, what the ancient Greeks used to wipe themselves with, why kings ran away from their own palaces, why all of Europe one day stopped washing out of fear, and the engineer who saved millions of lives by fighting just a bad smell. This is not a story about cleanliness, my friends. It's a story about survival. So make yourself comfortable. And please don't touch that sponge. Let me take you to a place called Skara Brae, on the windswept Orkney Islands off the coast of Scotland. Here, in a stone village built around 3000 BC, older than the Egyptian pyramids, archaeologists have discovered something remarkable in the walls of the houses, small stone niches with drains underneath. Their purpose, as it turned out later, was to carry the waste away from the dwelling. Even in the Stone Age, it was clear to people that it was not a good idea to do this where you slept. Let's move south and east to the great cities of the Indus Valley, such as Mohenjo-Daro, which dates back to around 2500 BC. Here, you would find houses made of burnt bricks connected to covered street drains, as well as private latrines that were flushed with water from a jug, a sophisticated sewerage system thousands of years before London dreamed of it. The truth, my friends, is that humanity has always been concerned about its own cleanliness. The history of hygiene is not a straight march from the dirty past to the clean present. It is a winding road full of clever leaps forward and astonishing reversals. Imagine Rome, the 2nd century AD. You're walking through the bustling and cramped streets of Subura, and do you know what the city excelled at? Public toilets. They were known as latrines. These were not the private stalls we cherish today. Instead, imagine a long marble bench with holes cut into it, side by side, with a running water trough beneath it, fed by aqueducts that drained into the great Cloaca Maxima. And on these marble seats, the Romans would converse. Imagine a senator discussing the price of grain with a merchant, both sitting in the friendly company of a dozen other men, with no partitions in between. Privacy was, let's say, of secondary importance to the Romans, and in wealthy households, the marble seats were so icy that the owner would send a slave to sit first to warm the stone. A chilly position if you think about it. And now a detail that you used to live without, but can no longer. There was no paper. Instead, the Romans used a tassorium, a natural sea sponge mounted on a stick. After use, it was rinsed in a trough of running water or vinegar and was apparently reused, passed on to the next master. A shared sponge. Both the poet Martial and the philosopher Seneca mention the unfortunate person whose job involved this sponge. You can't help but feel sorry for the next person in line. But hygiene was also a symbol of status in Rome. A wealthy patrician had running water in his villa, while a poor man in a high-rise building, an insula, used a communal chamber pot on the landing. And if you lived on the 5th floor, it was tiring, to say the least, to go down every time you had to go to the bathroom. The contents of chamber pots often left the house in the shortest possible way, through the window. And Roman law had this in mind. There was a special lawsuit, the Actio de Effusis et Deictis, on what is poured out and thrown away. If something was poured out or thrown out of a window and it injured a passerby, the landlord was responsible, even if it was not the landlord who poured it out, but a guest or a slave. For damaged goods, the cost of the goods was paid. For a free man wounded, the cost of his treatment was paid. And for a man killed, a fine of 50,000 sesterces was paid. And do not think that this was merely a matter of disgust. Not only the contents, but also the heavy clay pot itself, a projectile capable of breaking a man's head, was thrown from the 5th floor. The law doesn't right itself against a non-existent threat. If the lawyers have foreseen it, it means that people were indeed maimed and killed by what poured from above. The city stank, and the law took it seriously. What exactly did our ancestors use to clean themselves after going to the bathroom? In Greece, they used stones, smooth pebbles and fragments of pottery called pessoi. And here's the beauty of it. Archaeologists have found potsherds used for this purpose, which were ostraca, the very shards on which the Athenians scratched the names of those they wanted to vote out. This means that a Greek could literally wipe himself with the name of his political enemy. There's something delightfully human about that. In ancient China and Japan, people preferred to use a chugi, a flat stick made of wood or bamboo that had been scraped clean. In China, paper was also used for toilet purposes as early as the early Middle Ages, long before this practice became common in other regions. In the Islamic world and most of Asia, people used plain water. It's as simple as that. In medieval Europe, people used hay, moss, leaves, rags, and for the wealthy, soft woolen cloths. There's a legend that the French nobility used lace and silk. And in rural America, until the 20th century, the most famous material was the Sears catalog, a thick book of mail-order items that hung in the backyard outhouse with pages torn out one by one. Customers complained that the glossy pages were not as useful for practical purposes. Now I invite you to the 11th century Normandy stone castle. We imagine them to be proud and majestic. Go inside. It's damp, dark, and frankly, it smells bad. Do you know what a wardrobe was in those days? It's not a wardrobe at all. It's a toilet. A cramped cubicle built into the wall and overhanging the moat, with a simple gutter through which sewage fell directly on the facade of the castle. The word wardrobe itself probably comes from the habit of hanging clothes there, as it was believed that ammonia vapors would keep moths away. Imagine the life of a real woman from that era. Let's call her Lady Eleanor. On a winter night, she wakes up in need. She doesn't want to leave her warm bed, as the stone is cold and the wardrobe is at the far end of the room, an icy chamber above a moat with a draft coming from the gutter. And here is Lady Eleanor's choice, to wade through the chilly hall to that drafty hole, or to wake the maid who is dozing by the door to fetch a chamber pot. Most often they chose the chamber pot. There is no flush. There is a basin, a maid, and a misfortune corner. The floors were covered with reeds and straw to absorb moisture and spills. When things got too disgusting, they were simply swept away and replaced. The Dutch scholar Erasmus of Rotterdam, who later visited English homes, wrote with disgust about the floors of old reeds which concealed spit, vomit, dog droppings, and worse. Here is a story that sounds like fiction, but is true. There's a belief that castles were so filthy that they were abandoned. Of course, no one left entire fortresses as it was too expensive. However, the royal court did move from residence to residence, and one of the reasons was the physical filth of the palace. The sewage pits overflowed and everything was soaked through. And while the king and his retinue moved to the next castle, the remaining servants cleaned, washed, and aired the abandoned rooms. In other words, the monarch moved out partly to give his home a chance to catch its breath. And the famous perfumes, musk, amber, heavy oils. Here I have to correct everyone's favorite myth. Perfume was not invented to overcome the stench of unwashed bodies. It is thousands of years older than these castles, born in Egypt and Mesopotamia as a luxury and a gift to the gods. But did people in the Middle Ages hold scented pomanders to their noses to endure a cramped and smelly room? Yes, they did. The scent didn't create cleanliness, it just made the dirt tolerable. No story about dirt is complete without Versailles, and no palace has been the subject of so many legends. You've probably heard the stories about wide-brimmed hats being invented to reflect the contents of pots thrown out of windows, and high heels being created to elevate ladies above the filth on the streets. I'm sorry to spoil the fun, but both of these claims were made later. Hats were used to protect against the sun and to indicate social status. Heels came from Persian horsemen, who used them to rest their feet in the stirrups, and only later became the pinnacle of male aristocratic fashion. Venetian chopines, shoes with a huge platform, did indeed help to rise above puddles, but above all, they conveyed that this person was too important to walk on ordinary ground. And yet, beneath every myth lies a grain of truth. Versailles, the glittering palace of the Sun King, was a place of real suffering. There were plenty of toilets and chamber pots, but with thousands of courtiers and servants, the corridors, staircases, and gardens were often used as latrines. Royal decrees explicitly prohibited courtiers from using the passageways for bodily functions. The most opulent palace in Europe issued official bans on defecation in indoor spaces. And then there were the wigs. Wigs. To combat lice, fashion-conscious men and women shaved their heads and wore high powdered wigs, dusted with flour or starch. These wigs were rarely cleaned, and they often harbored their own small colonies of lice and other pests. To slow down the infestation, wigs were sometimes baked in ovens. The grandiose fashion of the era was essentially an elaborate hat for a bald and itchy head. But before I turn to the East, I must dispel a misconception about Europe itself. It is commonly believed that the West simply did not know how to wash. It is not true. In the Middle Ages, public baths flourished in cities, a legacy of Rome, partly brought back by the Crusaders from the East. People steamed, washed, talked, and feasted in them. There were dozens of them in Paris alone. Europe knew perfectly well what a clean body was, and then she gave up on it. In the 16th and 17th centuries, washing went out of fashion in Europe, and there were 3 reasons. The plague and syphilis forced the baths to be considered breeding grounds for infection, and they were closed. Doctors of that time seriously taught that hot water opens the pores of the body and lets in disease, which means that bathing is simply dangerous for health. The baths themselves earned a reputation as brothels. As a result, a 17th century nobleman might go years without taking a bath, believing that it was good for his health. He would often change his clean shirt, believing that this was sufficient. Europe knew about baths, but out of fear, it rejected them. Now, let's turn our attention to the East. In Russia, foreign ambassadors expected to find savagery, but instead, they discovered baths and steam baths in the heart of every village and every household. Russians bathed with a devotion that left their guests in dismay. They sat in clouds of steam, whipped themselves with birch brooms to circulate their blood, and then plunged into icy rivers or rolled in the snow. German and other Western ambassadors described this with a mixture of horror and admiration, as regular bathing had long since fallen out of fashion in their own lands. The backward Russians, in fact, bathed much more often than Westerners. And in Japan, cleanliness was not just a habit, it was woven into the very soul of the culture. Centuries before Europe rediscovered bathing, the Japanese were already soaking in volcanic hot springs called onsen and ritual ablutions. Washing one's hands and mouth before entering a temple were a sacred act. For the Japanese, bathing was not just about washing away dirt. They first washed themselves from the outside before entering the communal bath, so that the hot water would remain clean for relaxation and contemplation. This was a level of cleanliness that most of Europe would have to wait hundreds of years to achieve. London, in the middle of the 19th century, is a city suffocating from itself. The Thames was no longer a river, but an open sewer fed by the waste of 3 million people and the effluence of slaughterhouses and factories. And then came the summer of 1858, and the heat and the smell that history remembers as a great stench. The stench rising from the Thames became so unbearable that the work of Parliament itself almost stopped. The curtains of the coastal halls were soaked in bleach. Members of the House pressed handkerchiefs to their faces and fled. Nothing clears the government's mind more than an odor that cannot be escaped. And then Joseph Bazalgette, a quiet, tenacious engineer, stepped onto the scene. He proposed what many thought was madness: a network of giant brick sewers beneath the city, carrying London's filth far downstream. Critics called it a colossal waste of money, a hole in the ground at the expense of the treasury. But Bazalgette built it. 82 miles of main sewers with brick vaults, so skillfully constructed that most of them still carry London's sewage today. And here's the exquisite irony. Bazalgette built his collectors not because he understood the nature of germs. The theory of infectious bacteria had not yet been recognized. Like almost everyone in his time, he believed in miasmas, that disease was spread by bad air, by the smell itself. He built his great system to banish the stench. But by diverting the sewage away from the drinking water, he unknowingly cut off the true killer, the cholera vibrio in the water supply. He was right, but for the wrong reason, and in doing so, he saved tens of thousands of lives. Today, we pull a small lever, and the problem simply disappears. We don't even think about it. We have inherited purity as if it were a natural state of the world, when in fact it is one of the most difficult achievements in human history. So think for a moment of the hands that made it, of the workers of Bazalgette, laying brick by brick in the darkness beneath the pavements, of the nameless Roman who wielded that ill-fated sponge, of Lady Eleanor in her cold stone castle, breathing through a cloud of musk, of the Greek who wiped away his sorrows with a pot with the enemy's name on it. It is worth noting that the smell of the body was not always as repulsive as it is today. Sometimes it was even attractive. There's a legend, and legends rarely come out of thin air, that Napoleon, returning from a campaign, sent a note to Josephine. "I'll be back in 3 days. Don't wash yourself." But that, my friends, is a different story. It's not about toilets, but about the human body and its scents. And one day, I'll tell you that story too. 5,000 years, my friends, from a stone drain on a windswept island to the lever in your hand. So next time you turn on the faucet or pull that lever, give a small nod to the long line of smart, desperate, and inventive souls who made it possible. They deserve it. We simply reap the rewards.